Good morning, everybody. Welcome to, I guess, day 3 of the Congress. So, my name's Lucas. I'm one of the founders and the CEO of Modulize. I want to be talking about 3 things today, and I will be doing that together with Ambra from VELUX, who I'll let introduce herself in a minute, but I'll set the scene a little bit. So, what we do at Modulize is we're building a marketplace for offsite construction. So helping construction companies, developers adopt more offsite construction, prefabrication, modular construction. And we do that for a couple of different reasons. So one, we think moving to higher degrees of offsite construction is really one of the major paradigm shifts that we need for the construction industry to remain viable, to become more sustainable. And the other 2 topics that I want to be touching upon, and then we'll bring in living places as a bit of a case study here, is how we can drive sustainability, in this case, through higher degrees of offsite construction. Maybe also what are some of the challenges in doing so, and also what role does technology need to play. So my background is not in construction. I'm originally from the tech sector. So it's been a really interesting experience getting into this space, and from working in other sectors, I see there's a lot of crossovers and a lot of potential that isn't quite being exploited yet when it comes to adopting data-driven approaches, adopting technology to help with addressing some of the major challenges that we see in the construction industry. And in our minds, with what we do at Modulize, that all leads back to bringing these things together. So using technology and data-driven solutions to help the different stakeholders in the construction value chain to adopt offsite construction in a more meaningful way, because we think that all then brings us to the point in the middle, which is the other topic, sustainability. So with offsite construction, we can massively cut waste from construction projects, in some cases by up to 90%. We do that because we move work into a more controlled environment, into factories where we produce these partial building elements or modules, so that will be entire rooms. But we also do that by producing often higher quality buildings, so tighter building envelopes, which lead to less energy leakage. And then also when we look at the end of the life of a building, we increase reusability of parts of the building. So you can think of reusing entire walls, entire rooms, instead of trying to reclaim raw materials once a building reaches the end of its lifetime. That, however, depends on things like good uses of data, because we need good standardization, we need good documentation, because otherwise all these reusability potential, they get lost. So that's why I really think these 3 topics, offsite construction, sustainability, and technology, are very closely connected, and if we bring them all together, there's a lot of things that we can do really well in terms of helping the construction industry become more sustainable and also continue to be viable, because there's other topics that we're not going to talk about as much today. For example, labor availability or the lack of labor availability. So if you look at housing shortages across the globe, governments trying to meet housing targets and it not really happening. One of the reasons for that are labor shortages. So skilled labor is getting more and more scarce. So that's another challenge that we can at least pretty meaningfully address with offsite construction, but we won't talk about that too much today. With that, I'll bring in Ambra. So I will let you introduce yourself and maybe introduce Living Places as a project as well a little bit. So I guess not everybody maybe has heard too much about it yet. So I'll hand over to you for a couple of minutes and then we'll dive in.
So hello, everyone. I'm Ambra. I work at VELUX in a function called Buildings of the Future. I mainly work in business development, and I've been behind Living Places. I've been part of the team from the beginning. And Living Places is born as an experimental project that we started to really go out and try to figure out how much we can reduce the carbon footprint of buildings. And see if we could do that in a partnership with some actors from the building industry. And that's what we did, together with the Effect architects and Artelia engineers. And I mean, basically, the project started more as a brainstorming, as really bringing ideas and some innovation in, trying to find a new process also to design buildings in a different way. And then after this very long brainstorming, which was very different from the business as usual of designing buildings, then we started the design of Living Places after we had already a concept ready. And that lasted almost 3 years. So it's a very long building design process, we can say. But yes, also in living places, we use the prefab construction, not for all the elements, but for the core structure.
Yeah, great. And so when we talk about offsite construction, I think this is one of the really important pieces to think about, actually. It's not always about what can we do to maximize the use of offsite? Can we just do everything in a factory and just dump the thing onto the construction site? The way that we think about this at Modulize is that for every project, there's really this optimal distribution typically between the things that should happen in a factory and the things that should happen on a construction site. From our experience, what we've seen is that on average, when you look at a larger portfolio of projects, where we end up is usually that distribution is more biased towards higher degrees of on-site construction. So doing more work on the construction site than is necessary or is maybe the best possible setup. And that leads to a place where a lot of the potential benefits of, if you will, industrializing the building process get left on the table. And that's one of the things that we're trying to correct a little bit by building this platform or marketplace to connect these different stakeholders, have contractors and developers find better ways of really optimizing, finding this optimal distribution between the work that you can do in a factory and the work that still needs to be done on a construction site. Because for most projects, especially larger ones, more complex ones, or I guess also something like living places where you're really quite in the more experimental end of the spectrum, trying to figure out better ways of working, it isn't necessarily about everything should be off-site, everything should be built in a factory. It's really how can we maximize the potential of the different modalities, the different methodologies of building. And then it's also project dependent what you want to optimize for. Is it the environmental footprint? Is it cost? Is it time? And then probably, again, you need to find that optimal distribution between these things. And maybe you can talk to that a little bit more about living places, where from my understanding, some of it is related to, or some of the focus was about not just showing, okay, we can do the most sustainable thing in the world, but we can actually do that in a cost-efficient way, and we can actually optimize these things so that we can show this is not just an experiment, but we can actually scale the thing over time. So maybe you can talk a little bit more about that process.
Yeah, exactly. I think one of the purpose, it was not only to show that you could build more sustainably, but it was also about the affordability and the scalability. So having something that can be scaled, can be replicated also in different dimensions, in different setups.
Yeah.
And that's why also we try to have some parts, some elements prefabricated to also ease the construction on site. Yeah. But actually we realized that we could have done more.
Yeah.
In a project like this, maybe it's not that easy because you're not producing a very large volume. Yeah. So you are like producing very small elements, which doesn't make it necessarily affordable. Yeah. Yeah. So you need a larger volume to make it to make the real affordability.
Yeah.
But building a full village, then it makes sense to have more than just the core, probably. Yeah. Prefabricated. And then, of course, we wanted to have an easy construction on site and be especially more protected from the weather conditions. Yeah. We didn't want to risk that the material would get too wet or damaged by the weather. And prefabrication, of course, allows to build everything. Yeah. in a more controlled indoor environment, and that was the perfect choice for the core structure, especially.
Yeah, yeah. No, and I think you touch on a really important point as well here in terms of the scalability of off-site construction. Obviously, for projects or for also these manufacturers of these building elements to really leverage the factory setup, there is a certain scale at which it really starts to make more and more sense. We've seen small projects as well, and you will see also obviously a very big part of the market is single-family housing, but often it's then trying to stay as close as possible to a certain predefined set of kit of parts, if you like, in these single-family housing projects. And I guess maybe if we can talk a little bit more about kind of how you envision that scaling journey to look like. Is it then because you have, with living places, defined the different structures, right, that would make up the options that you can build out as part of living places and scaling it. So if you can talk a little bit more about how you think about that. Do you really look at it as this, we have basically a catalog of Lego blocks that we then need to piece together to build larger projects, or is there more flexibility that you envision? So if you want to talk a little bit about that, maybe.
It's a little bit of both,
Yeah.
maybe. In the idea of scaling living places, of course, we want to build like villages that are with different, covering different needs, so probably different houses, different modules. But what is behind the prefabrication is probably having more defined modules. So having those elements that are possible to just build on site. And we did that just with the core structure of the walls. And we could do probably more as a next step. So in this case, we did a lot on site. And we learned that probably more elements could have been done off-site.
Yeah.
And something we have been wondering, and that has been also a challenge, was how can we make also more part of the wall? So probably even the full wall prefab. We didn't do the cladding and the fiber gypsum, so the interior and exterior finishing as prefab, but it was done on site.
Yeah.
And that's because we were worried that it would be damaged with transportation and that it was not a super strong, of course, the fiberboard is not that strong material, so you have to be careful, it's delicate. And we didn't want to make it ruin for construction. So we did that on site. But maybe there is a way to do that, also prefab, to have that attached to the core and have the full element already ready for the construction. And another part is the hole of the windows. If that can be done ready, more ready than we did. Because of course, doing that on site requires a lot of precision in putting in the window, in sealing, and having like everything airtight and avoid leakaging. So that's also something that takes a lot of time. And if we can find a way to have that more ready, that would for sure speed up the construction.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's also, when we talk about offsite construction, I mentioned that there's like different levels of flexibility that you can introduce, but also to that point, there's these different degrees of finish that you will put on the elements. You go all the way from, if we talk timber, the kind of lowest degree of finish is pre-cut. So you literally just cut the beams, and then you assemble everything into, say, the walls, the flooring, the roofing elements on site. And then you go all the way to the other end of the spectrum, where you have fully finished walls, sometimes including cladding, insulation, electricity, everything in the wall, windows also mounted and installed in the factory. And then again, it's about finding out for this given project, where should you land? So, and then also obviously going into, is timber, for example, is it the right material for this given project? And that's also one of the things that we want to try and do with Modulize, because there's so many different parameters that if you're actually going to find that sweet spot of how prefabrication modular construction can really deliver benefit to the project, there's a lot of complexity in figuring out the material, the level of finish of the different elements, how far should you push the use of offsite construction in a project. So there's a lot of complexity. So we're trying to build this network of manufacturers as well to then help extrapolate and extract these insights from that network to help the contractor and ultimately also the developer to figure out what is the best approach. So maybe if we talk a little bit more about some of the challenges as well of offsite construction, because while we obviously believe offsite construction is great and everybody should be at least considering it for projects, it's not all great, because probably otherwise everybody would already be just doing it. So offsite construction has been around forever. It's not a new concept. It's kind of had its day already a couple of times, and then it fizzled out a bit for various reasons. But because of all of these pressures that we now see on the construction industry, whether it is the environmental requirements, the low margins, the pressure to build faster related to higher interest rates, all of that pushes more and more construction companies, contractors to more seriously consider offsite construction. But then they come up against certain challenges. Some of these challenges are solvable through some of the work that we do in terms of helping get over the hump in terms of having the right information available. But then there's some other challenges as well that maybe aren't as clearly and easily addressable. And I think maybe through living places, there's maybe a couple of learnings, I imagine, even though
Definitely.
I guess that wasn't your main role in the project, but I guess you were pretty involved. So if you want to talk a little bit about a little bit more about some of the challenges. And then one thing that I thought was really interesting, we can maybe try and get into as well, is that Living Places has the 2 full houses, and you actually used different approaches, right? So one is built using cross-laminated timber, CLT, and the other one is used building timber frames.
Yes.
So maybe we can also get into that a little bit, because I think that's pretty cool, and I'll talk about why I think that's cool after. But maybe we can start with some of the challenges that you guys experienced.
Yeah. There were a few challenges, of course, as you said. And I think one, you already touched upon it, which is the collaboration.
Yeah.
It requires a very high level of collaboration
Yeah.
between all the different parties, from the architects, structural engineers, up to the manufacturer and the developer. So you really need the high level of collaboration.
Yes.
They all need to be on board. They all need to know what are exactly the modules that are being built and how to assemble those. And that was one of the challenges. And then, of course, the assembling on site, it was not always super easy, because there are some parts, joints, for example, they are super accurate and very delicate. They have to be, how do you say, strong and very resilient to a lot of different stress. And you need to be careful on how you assemble those to don't damage them or risk leakaging and so on. So the joints were definitely one of the challenges. And then, for example, one that I remember is when we got the module of the stairs. The stairs had to be like one block fitting exactly in a space.
Yeah.
And that's a level of precision that you have to be really precise on the millimeters with what you do on site, because the block of the stairs is going in a space that has been created on site with maybe a slightly different level of precision. So that can be a bit of a challenge, that you do something super accurate and then the rest on site is maybe slightly less accurate, and then you have those challenges of fitting in blocks that are maybe not super precise.
Yeah.
So that was one that I remember, but I think in general, like having the accuracy, the same accuracy that has been used in the factory, you need to have it on site.
Yes.
And that's not always easy to have. It's not always immediate.
Yeah.
And also the labor on site is not always easy to find.
Yeah.
Because of course, because you need this highly skilled labor, and we don't have machinery to do that.
Yeah.
We lack a little bit of automation on site.
Yeah.
So that's one of the challenges that we should probably solve in the future.
Yeah, no, definitely. And so I think talking a little bit more about the challenges, or then also like talking a little bit more about what I mentioned previously, what I thought was pretty cool, that you, with Living Places, built these different structures and have 2 fully built and fitted out houses with these different approaches. And I think it points to one of the other, I believe, challenges that we have with offsite construction, which isn't as much about the engineering, about the precision. And that, I think, is another really interesting topic that we can maybe dive into. But one other challenge that we see is that it's very, very difficult for the construction company, the contractor, often to make the jump, because it's difficult to compare things on a like-for-like basis. So when you're a general contractor that's been around for decades and you have done dozens, hundreds of projects using mostly on-site construction, you have really good both historical data and insights and experience with what works, how do you compare things, how do you interpret a cost, because a cost is not just a cost, right? It's always other things come with it. And then when you get to the point where you want to consider offsite construction, how do you get to that place where you can actually compare these different modalities on a like-for-like basis is often super difficult. So In the case of living places, it was two different approaches, both using some degree of offsite construction, which you can then actually start to use as case studies to compare these, in this case, two different approaches, both using offsite construction. But for example, we've also been working with a contractor in Oslo, where Modulize is based, trying to get into a project. We're not quite there, but maybe we'll manage, where they were actually considering to build two almost identical multifamily unit housing blocks, one of them using higher degrees of offsite construction, and the second one being almost entirely built on site. And those kinds of projects, case studies, sources of data are really missing, because it's super hard to compare things when you don't actually go through the full life cycle. Because what happens a lot today with the contractors, the construction company, comparing on-site versus off-site construction, it's often done mostly at the material level, and then you don't really get into what potential benefits there are on an end-to-end, from an end-to-end perspective. So a really simple example, when you use higher degrees of off-site construction for larger projects, multi-story projects, you need very little scaffolding, which is a major cost point for bigger projects. When you have scaffolding for 12 months and you reduce that to a couple of months, that's a major cost item that typically doesn't get taken into account. So there's a lot of things that we still need to do in terms of having really the data available and the insights available to compare these different modalities on a like-for-like basis. So I think projects where you are almost building the same thing, but you do it using different modalities. In this case, CLT and timber frame. But in other cases, you may have CLT and fully on-site. And getting these kinds of projects, I think, is one of the good opportunities to not just collect data and insights, but actually then also make it more tangible. Because then you can use these projects, and the buildings are there. You can compare them. You can you can show the differences just by something that is very tangible. So I thought that was one reason why I thought it was really cool. Not that that one part was fully on-site and the other part off-site, but still taking a couple of different approaches to try and produce the same result. And then you can start to see, okay, what was good about CLT? What was good about timber frame? What were the differences? What was bad about one or the other? And how do you take those learnings then into the scaling phase? So I thought that was a really, really cool part of living places. So I don't know if you have any insights into that decision-making process, how you as a group got to deciding that you wanted to do one using CLT and the other one timber frame.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think we started to look at different construction type and technologies, systems, how to even ventilate the house and so on. Yeah. And that's exactly when we said, okay, we have too many good systems that we could use. Let's try and build two different houses and test two different construction systems, two different ventilation systems, different control system. So that's where we had also, we were lucky that we could take this also liberty to say, okay, let's do two different and compare them and see which one is working in the best way. And then maybe you don't get necessarily to the point where you say, oh, this one is working better than this one. No. But maybe they're both performing well. And in the end, the difference in terms of CO2, in terms of indoor air quality, thermal comfort is not that high. Yeah. They are performing quite similarly. So we can actually say that you have a lot of choices. You can still build houses that are affordable in similar ways, because they're not that different. They have a good indoor air quality, both of them. So you can reach that both with hybrid ventilation and with natural ventilation. And then you can build with CLT or with timber, and you still end up with a good house with a very low carbon footprint and a good structure and livability also inside. Yeah. So I think the difference is probably more in the construction and prefabrication process, because in CLT you can, of course, prefab more. With the timber frame, we just had the core. With CLT, we had the CLT module, but also the insulation and core module. So we had kind of two blocks already prefabricated. So that can kind of speed up a little bit more the process. With timber, you're not completely on site, but you have a bit less. And we could have done more also on the timber side. So that's also a choice in terms of construction and project
Yeah.
that has to be also decided up front in the design phases.
Have you already, and that maybe then touches, takes us a little bit into the direction of like technology and data and the impact of using more data-driven approaches to maybe help with a project like that, to really nail, okay, what did we learn here? How do you collect these insights? How do you take them forward into the scaling journey? Maybe, I don't know how involved you've been in that, but if you can talk a little bit about what that looks like for you guys, like how do you capture these learnings, and then maybe whether that's from an indoor air quality perspective or from a construction process, from a cost, environmental footprint process, how do you as a group capture all of these learnings and make sure that you then are able to use those learnings as you look into the future towards scaling this project?
Yeah, we made sure that on the way we were capturing all the learnings coming in, and we had a good process of elaborating this learning into some next steps or what to do better in the future.
Yeah.
And we collected all of them from the design phase and the construction phase so far. And we have them all in a package, in a document that is actually available on our website on buildforlife.com. And it's free, open source. You can just download it and read all the learnings that we collected from the first two phases, so design and construction. We will go through a phase of deconstruction. It says, design for disassembly, so we will have to experiment also that part. That will be the second part for next year probably, and there we will have more learnings, because of course we will figure out what went wrong also in the disassembly phase, because you believe everything is done for disassembly, but then that's another phase that you have to try.
Things will break.
So that's those will be the next part of the learnings. And in the use phase, we are collecting data from the indoor air quality and thermal comfort. We are monitoring both buildings and checking how is the temperature during the day, how is the building reacting with the active house with the system, with the VELUX active system, and how is the also the indoor air quality in both houses, to really compare if the hybrid ventilation is giving an added value, or if natural ventilation is actually performing in a similar way. And we also used an active house radar for both houses, which is a certification that helps you keep an overview of all these parameters and check the performance of the building. So we are trying also to have a dynamic radar that is following the performance of the house, how it's changing.
Nice, very cool. So I think we're coming up at time, so maybe just to wrap up. So for me, I think Living Places is a really cool case study for many reasons, but obviously because we at Modulize, we work on helping to scale and increase the adoption of offsite construction, I wanted to pick out that particular piece, which I think, because you can see both the promise, the opportunity, but also some of the challenges that come with using offsite construction, using prefabrication, modular construction, I think it's a really, really great case study. And I do hope that as you kind of move into the next phase of that journey, as we look more at how can this project be scaled and continue to be built, there's a whole kind of other unlock here when it comes to using offsite construction, because as you said earlier, once you get to a certain level of scale and you move beyond a proof of concept where you don't really get the economies of scale, you open up this whole opportunity space in terms of being able to define the different approaches and then figuring out what's the right level of flexibility to maintain, and then really leveraging what is great about moving work into the factory, which is getting to a certain level of scale so that you can really get to this repeatable process. And the further you scale a project like Living Places, the bigger the benefits get. So I think it's really exciting to see where you guys take this. So I'm going to be following very closely. Thanks a lot for joining me on stage. It was a slightly short notice, but really appreciate it. And yeah, do check Modulize out as well. You can find us at modulize.com, very simple. And thanks so much for listening. And also feel free to come and find me after. Thanks a lot, guys.